In September 1939, the storm of war swept across Europe with terrifying speed. Over just 10 days, the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany escalated into a global conflict, marking the start of World War II. At precisely 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte near Danzig, signaling the start of the invasion of Poland. The Germans had assembled a massive invasion force. Over 1.5 million soldiers, 2,750 tanks, and 2,315 aircraft, all prepared to execute a highly coordinated blitzkrieg offensive. This strategy of rapid and overwhelming force, combining air, armored, and infantry units, was designed to disorient and crush the enemy before they could mount a defense. The Battle of the Westerplatte. The attack on Westerplatte was symbolic and strategically important. A small Polish force of 182 soldiers faced an intense German naval bombardment, followed by ground assaults. Despite being vastly outnumbered and cut off from reinforcements, the Polish garrison held out for 7 days, an early example of the fierce resistance that would characterize the Polish defense. Air assaults across Poland. Simultaneously, the Luftwaffe unleashed its bombers on major Polish cities, including Warsaw, Lodz, and Krakow. In the city of Wilan, a savage air raid reduced much of the town to rubble, killing around 1,200 civilians in one of the first atrocities of the war. German Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters and Junkers Ju 87 Stuka dive bombers reigned supreme in the skies, systematically neutralizing the small and outdated Polish Air Force. The Northern and Southern Fronts. While German forces from the Wehrmacht's Army Group North, commanded by General Fedor von Bock, advanced from East Prussia towards Warsaw, Army Group South under General Gerd von Rundstedt moved through Silesia, aiming to encircle Polish forces. The Polish defenses, stretched thin across multiple fronts, struggled to respond to the ferocity of the attack. The world finally react. On September 2nd, the Polish army attempted to regroup and launch counterattacks. In the north, the Battle of Mlawa saw Polish forces engage German panzer divisions, but the overwhelming power of the tanks proved too much. Meanwhile, the Polish cavalry, armed mostly with rifles and sabers, found themselves vulnerable to the German mechanized forces. As news of the invasion spread across Europe, diplomatic responses were swift. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany, fulfilling their commitments to Poland under mutual defense pacts. However, neither country was prepared for immediate military action. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, began mobilizing, but it would take weeks for them to land in France. The French army launched a limited offensive into the Saarland region of Germany, but this was a token effort that quickly stalled. Operation Pied Piper. In Britain, the government launched Operation Pied Piper, a mass evacuation of children and vulnerable citizens from cities thought to be in danger of German bombing. By the end of September 3rd, more than 1.4 million children, teachers, and their families had been relocated to the countryside. Warsaw under siege. In Poland, the situation worsened as German forces moved ever closer to Warsaw. By September 4th, the Polish capital was in the crosshairs of the advancing German army. Luftwaffe bombing raids intensified, with the Germans dropping hundreds of tons of explosives on military and civilian targets alike. Warsaw's defenses were quickly overwhelmed, but the city would not fall without a fight. On the front lines, Polish forces, numbering around 1 million, were scattered and retreating under the relentless German advance. The Polish military, equipped mostly with outdated World War I era equipment, was no match for the 60 German divisions, which included 10 armored divisions and 6 motorized divisions. The Polish army did, however, achieve some notable victories in skirmishes, such as at the Battle of Wisco, but these were small and could not alter the course of the larger campaign. The fall of Krakow. On September 6th, the ancient city of Krakow fell to German forces without significant resistance, marking a major milestone in the German conquest of southern Poland. Polish forces in the region, demoralized and cut off from reinforcements, were unable to hold their ground. As German columns advanced further east, the situation became increasingly dire for the Polish government, which relocated to Lublin in an attempt to continue the fight. German forces, now operating with speed and precision, linked up their northern and southern divisions, effectively encircling Warsaw. The siege of Warsaw was now fully underway, and the city's residents prepared for the worst. The encirclement of Warsaw. By September 8th, German forces had reached the outskirts of Warsaw. The capital was surrounded by German Army Group South, with the 4th Panzer Division leading the charge into the city's suburbs. The Polish defenders, both military and civilian, braced for an all-out assault, but the Luftwaffe's bombing raids had already inflicted heavy damage. Key infrastructure, including bridges and railroads, was destroyed, making it difficult for the Polish army to regroup and resupply. Despite this, Warsaw's defenders, numbering around 120,000 soldiers, prepared to resist. General Julius Rommel, commander of the Warsaw defense, called on every able-bodied citizen to help fortify the city. Trenches were dug, barricades erected, and makeshift defenses put in place. Civilians joined soldiers on the front lines, determined to defend their capital. Warning: a global conflict. By September 10th, the first phase of the invasion was nearly complete. Polish forces were in full retreat, and German armies had captured vast swathes of Polish territory. The destruction of Warsaw seemed inevitable, but the defenders continued to hold out. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, Britain and France prepared for war but remained largely passive, focusing on defensive preparations. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt reiterated America's stance of neutrality, but behind the scenes, there were growing concerns about the potential impact of the war on global stability. Across the Atlantic, Japan, though not yet involved in the European conflict, watched closely, as did the Soviet Union, which had a secret agreement with Germany under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to divide Poland once the invasion was complete. The first 10 days of September 1939 were a harrowing preview of the destruction that would soon engulf the world. Poland, though fighting valiantly, was slowly being crushed by the might of Nazi Germany, while the rest of the world stood at the precipice of total war. The war had only just begun. Poland's resistance weakens. As the second week of September 1939 began, Poland's defense lines were collapsing under the weight of Germany's blitzkrieg. The Polish army, despite valiant efforts, was stretched too thin to hold its ground. The German military had deployed over 60 divisions, including 10 armored divisions, which had effectively split Poland into isolated pockets of resistance. On September 11th, the Germans captured the key industrial city of Katowice, further crippling Poland's ability to continue the war. The siege of Warsaw intensifies. In Warsaw, the situation grew increasingly dire. German forces encircled the city from all sides, bombarding it day and night. Luftwaffe bombers pounded Warsaw's infrastructure, cutting off water supplies and damaging communication lines. The 4th Panzer Division continued its assault, but Polish defenders held their ground, hoping for reinforcements that would never arrive. The Germans estimated that Warsaw could fall within days, but the city's defenders, despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, showed no signs of surrender. German advances continue. On September 13th, German forces began a new offensive towards the eastern part of Poland. The goal was to link up with units advancing from the north and south, completing the encirclement of Polish forces. The German 8th Army, under General Johannes Blaskowitz, pushed further into central Poland, capturing Lodz on September 14th. Lodz, one of Poland's major industrial centers, was crucial for the Polish war effort, and its fall dealt a severe blow to Poland's capacity to resist. In response to the relentless German advances, the Polish government and military command began preparations for an evacuation to Romania, where they hoped to regroup and continue the fight. Diplomatic maneuvers and Soviet intentions. While the Germans advanced through Poland, diplomatic negotiations between Germany and the Soviet Union continued. Under the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union was preparing to invade Poland from the east. For now, Soviet forces remained on the sidelines, waiting for the right moment to strike. The battle for Lwów and Soviet preparations. In the eastern city of Lwów, Polish forces were engaged in a fierce battle against advancing German units. The Germans, eager to capture the city before the Soviets intervened, launched repeated assaults on September 15th. However, Lwow's defenders, including both military and civilian volunteers, mounted a stubborn defense. Though surrounded, the defenders inflicted heavy losses on the German attackers, stalling their advance. Soviet preparations for invasion. Meanwhile, on the eastern border of Poland, Soviet forces were preparing for their own invasion. The Soviet Union had mobilized over 40 divisions, including armored and infantry units, under the pretext of protecting the Ukrainian and Belarusian populations in eastern Poland. By September 16th, reports of Soviet troop movements had reached the Polish High Command. But with their forces fully engaged in the west, Poland had little hope of defending against a two-front assault. The Soviet Union invades Poland. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union officially invaded eastern Poland. Over 600,000 Soviet troops crossed the Polish border, advancing swiftly and meeting little resistance. The Polish army, already stretched thin and facing the full might of the German Wehrmacht, could do little to stop the Soviet advance. The Polish government, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, ordered its remaining forces not to engage Soviet troops, focusing instead on resisting the Germans. Soviet forces push west. The Soviets quickly occupied key cities, including Brest-Litovsk and Vilnius, capturing thousands of Polish soldiers who were caught between the advancing German and Soviet armies. In many cases, Soviet troops were welcomed by local Ukrainian and Belarusian populations, but for the Polish people, this invasion was yet another crushing blow. Polish soldiers, unable to fight on two fronts, were forced to surrender in large numbers, though some units continued to resist. The Battle of Brest and continued Soviet advances. On September 18th, Soviet forces captured the fortress city of Brest, which had been under siege by German forces. The fall of Brzesk was symbolic, as it marked the first joint military operation between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, though the two armies maintained a careful distance from one another. In the south, the Soviet invasion continued unabated. Polish forces attempted to regroup in the Carpathian Mountains, but with no hope of outside support and their supply lines cut, many units began to disband. Polish soldiers fled into Romania and Hungary, where they were interned but treated with sympathy by the local governments. The fall of Lwow and collapse of Polish resistance. Cut to scenes of Lwow's defenders surrendering. After days of fierce fighting, Lwow fell to Soviet forces on September 20th. The city's defenders, having fought bravely against both German and Soviet forces, were finally overwhelmed. With the fall of Lwow, organized Polish resistance in the east effectively collapsed. The Polish government, now in exile in Romania, could do little to coordinate further resistance. German-Soviet cooperation. In the west, German forces continued their advance, but by September 20th, they had largely completed their conquest of western Poland. The Germans and Soviets now stood as occupiers of Poland, dividing the country along the lines established in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In the coming days, German and Soviet forces would meet at the demarcation line, cementing their temporary alliance. The end of Poland's fight. The period from September 11th to 20th, 1939, marked the final collapse of Poland's ability to resist the combined forces of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Despite heroic efforts by the Polish army and its people, the overwhelming strength and coordination of the invaders were too much to withstand. By the end of September, most of Poland was under occupation, and the Polish government had fled the country. In these 10 days, the fate of Poland was sealed. The first nation to fall in World War II, its destruction at the hands of two totalitarian regimes set the stage for a conflict that would engulf the entire world. The courage and determination of the Polish people, however, would not be forgotten, and their struggle would continue in exile as they joined the fight alongside the Allies in the years to come. The fall of Eastern Poland. By September 21, 1939, Poland was on the verge of collapse. The Soviet invasion from the east, which had begun on September 17th, continued without resistance. The Polish military, already stretched thin by the German blitzkrieg, was powerless to stop the Soviet advance. The Red Army captured the cities of Grodno, Vilnius, and Pinsk with little opposition. Soviet forces moved quickly to secure eastern Poland, meeting German forces along the demarcation line outlined in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In areas now under Soviet control, the Red Army began arresting Polish officials and military officers. Thousands of Poles were deported to Siberia, while Soviet NKVD units started a campaign of political repression. The harsh reality of dual occupation began to set in for the Polish people. The German-Soviet Victory Parade in Brest-Litovsk. On September 22nd, in a moment that symbolized the uneasy alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, a joint victory parade was held in the city of Brest-Litovsk. German and Soviet soldiers marched side by side, celebrating their conquest of Poland. German General Heinz Guderian and Soviet General Semyon Krivoshein stood together, reviewing the troops. It was a stark reminder to the world that these two ideological opposites had, for the time being, set aside their differences to divide Poland between them. While the parade was presented as a demonstration of mutual respect, tensions between the two sides were already bubbling beneath the surface. Both powers were eager to solidify their spheres of influence, but their relationship would be short-lived, leading to future conflict. The Siege of Warsaw. In Warsaw, the situation had become desperate. German forces had fully encircled the city, and the bombardment was relentless. Luftwaffe planes dropped over 500 tons of bombs on the city between September 23rd and 24th, targeting military installations and civilian areas alike. Fires raged across Warsaw, with much of the city's infrastructure destroyed. Yet, the defenders of Warsaw refused to surrender. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, with thousands dying from bombs, artillery fire, and starvation. Despite the overwhelming odds, Warsaw's defenders, both soldiers and civilians, dug in, determined to hold out as long as possible. The city's commander, General Julius Rommel, continued to resist calls for surrender, hoping for support from France and Britain that would never come. The bombing of Warsaw. On September 25th, the German Luftwaffe launched one of the largest air raids of the campaign. Over 1,000 sorties were flown, and hundreds of tons of bombs were dropped on the already devastated city. This day became known as Black Monday in Warsaw. Hospitals, schools, and residential buildings were reduced to rubble. The goal of the German High Command was clear: Warsaw must be brought to its knees. The civilian population of Warsaw bore the brunt of the attack. In one instance, 300,000 leaflets were dropped over the city, urging surrender. But the people of Warsaw, led by their mayor, Stefan Starzyński, continued to resist. Starzyński became a symbol of defiance, giving radio broadcasts that inspired the people to keep fighting. But by now, it was clear that Warsaw could not hold out much longer. By September 26th, German forces had penetrated the outskirts of the city, and street-to-street fighting erupted in some neighborhoods. Despite dwindling supplies and ammunition, Polish defenders fought bravely, engaging in fierce combat with German infantry and panzer divisions. However, it was only a matter of time before the city's defenses crumbled. On September 27th, after weeks of relentless bombardment and with no hope of relief, Warsaw's defenders agreed to negotiate a ceasefire. The Polish army in Warsaw, exhausted and out of options, surrendered to the Germans. Over 140,000 Polish soldiers were taken prisoner, and the city, once a symbol of Polish resilience, was left in ruins. The capitulation of Warsaw. On September 28, 1939, Warsaw officially capitulated to the German forces. The city had endured a month of brutal siege, and its fall marked the symbolic end of Poland's resistance. German forces marched into the city, taking full control. For the people of Warsaw, the nightmare had only just begun. Under Nazi occupation, the city would become a focal point for the horrors of the war, with widespread repression, deportations, and executions to follow. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the German-Soviet Boundary Treaty, finalizing the partition of Poland. The eastern part of the country was ceded to the Soviet Union, while Germany solidified its control over the western regions. This agreement further cemented the uneasy alliance between Hitler and Stalin, dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence that would define much of the early war period. The final surrender of Poland. Even as Warsaw fell, isolated pockets of Polish resistance continued to fight. In the east, some Polish forces attempted to flee to neutral Romania or Hungary, while others were captured by the advancing Soviets. On September 29th, the last remaining Polish units in western Poland surrendered to the Germans. By the end of the month, organized Polish resistance had effectively ceased. The occupation of Poland by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was now complete. For the Polish people, the war was far from over. Resistance movements began to form almost immediately, with thousands of Poles going underground to fight against the occupiers. But for now, Poland as an independent nation had been erased from the map. The fall of Poland and the road ahead. As September came to a close, Poland was a nation in ruins. Divided between two totalitarian powers, its people faced a dark future of occupation, repression, and violence. The first major campaign of World War II had ended, but the war itself was only beginning. Nazi Germany, emboldened by its rapid victory, now turned its eyes westward, preparing for its next move. The world watched with a mixture of horror and uncertainty. Britain and France had declared war, but their forces remained largely inactive on the Western Front. As October approached, the so-called phony war would begin, a period of relative quiet that belied the storm of destruction that was to come. But the question on everyone's mind was clear. How long would it be before the war spread beyond Poland? What would Hitler's next move be? And could the Allies muster the strength to stop him before it was too late? In the next video, we'll explore the events of October 1939. The fall of Poland marks the end of the first phase of the war, but tensions across Europe will only grow. The Soviet Union will solidify its grip on Eastern Europe, while Germany prepares for its next campaign. The seeds of future conflicts are being sown, and the world braces for what comes next. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the story of World War II.